Something has gone terribly wrong in Tel Aviv. Not once, not twice, 58 times and counting. The city that hosts Israel's tech companies, its financial district, its cultural life, the city that was supposed to be unreachable, is now being hit by missiles traveling faster than anything most defense systems were ever designed to stop. And when the sirens go off, people don't walk to shelter. They run, because they've learned the hard way that the gap between launch and impact is measured in minutes. This isn't a border skirmish. This isn't a limited exchange of symbolic strikes. What is happening right now between Iran and Israel is a full-scale missile war, and the weapons Iran is using against Tel Aviv are unlike anything ever deployed in a live conflict in the modern Middle East. Tel Aviv didn't wake up expecting this. No one did. On February 28, 2026, a joint U.S.-Israeli strike campaign against Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure launched what would become one of the most consequential military escalations in modern history. Iran responded immediately, and it responded hard. Within hours, missiles were already in the air heading west, toward Israeli cities, toward U.S. military bases in the region, toward Ben Gurion Airport. The first night, a missile struck a residential neighborhood in central Tel Aviv. A building was ripped open, outer walls flayed apart. One person was KO'd, and several city blocks took damage as dozens of homes were destroyed or made uninhabitable. And that was just day one. In the weeks that followed, the strikes didn't taper off. They escalated, wave after wave, the IRGC calling each one a new phase of Operation True Promise 4. By March 18th, Iran had already conducted its 58th wave of strikes, 58 separate missile campaigns in under 3 weeks. The frequency alone tells you something has fundamentally changed about how this conflict is being fought. The residents of Tel Aviv are now living by a schedule they never agreed to. Air raid sirens activate without warning. Families stop mid-meal and move to shelters. Businesses close midday when threat alerts spike. Schools across significant portions of Israel have either moved to remote learning or suspended operations entirely. What was once an inconvenience in previous conflicts has become a permanent grinding disruption, and the weight of it accumulates with every passing day. On March 1st, around 40 buildings across the city were damaged in a single wave of strikes. Dozens were wounded. Metal barriers went up across multiple streets to protect pedestrians from the risk of collapsing facades. That is the physical reality of life in Tel Aviv right now, and most of the world is only seeing fragments of it. But the physical damage, as visible as it is only part of the picture. To understand why this is so hard to stop, you have to understand the weapons doing the damage, and none of them were chosen by accident. When the IRGC released footage of the Khorramshahr-4 launching toward Israel, analysts didn't describe it as a missile. They described it as a problem with no clean solution. Here's what makes it exceptional. The Khorramshahr-4 carries a warhead weighing up to 2 metric tons, roughly the weight of a mid-size SUV packed entirely with explosives, and it delivers that payload at speeds exceeding Mach 14. That's 14 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the kinetic energy alone is catastrophic before the warhead even detonates. Its range sits at approximately 3,000 kilometers. That means Iran's missile crews can fire it from deep inside Iranian territory, far from the front lines, far from any Israeli counterstrike, and still reach any target anywhere in Israel. There is no safe launch position that Israel can threaten or destroy before the missile is already airborne. But what made March 18, 2026 particularly dark wasn't the Khorramshahr-4's speed or range. It was what it was carrying. The IRGC has been deploying a cluster munition variant of this missile, a warhead that, instead of delivering a single devastating explosion, disperses up to 80 individual bomblets across a radius of 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers of civilian urban terrain suddenly seeded with explosive submunitions, each one capable of cowling or maiming anyone in its blast radius. On March 18th, Iran fired this variant directly at the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. An elderly couple in Ramat Gan was killed. Tel Aviv's Savador Central train station caught fire. Emergency response teams were dispatched to 34 separate impact sites across central Israel simultaneously. Israeli President Isaac Herzog visited the Ramat Gan site, standing in front of a building with its ceiling blown open, and called it what it was: a cluster missile deliberately targeting civilians. It didn't stop there. 3 days earlier, on March 1st, an Iranian ballistic missile struck the Ramat Lehi neighborhood and destroyed the Tiferet Israel synagogue, along with the bomb shelter built beneath it, the very place people ran to for safety. 9 civilians were killed. 46 more were injured. Amnesty International verified the strike using digital evidence and called for it to be investigated as a war crime. The convention banning cluster munitions has been signed by more than 100 nations. Iran is not among them, and while the legal debate unfolds in international chambers, the bomblets keep falling on Tel Aviv neighborhoods that were never military targets. But the Khorramshahr-4, as devastating as it is, isn't even the weapon that scares defense analysts most. That distinction belongs to something even harder to kill. Speed alone doesn't defeat a missile defense system. If a missile travels fast but in a predictable arc, a sophisticated interceptor can still calculate where it will be and meet it there. That's the mathematical foundation of every air defense system ever built. You don't chase the missile, you predict where it's going and put something in its path. The Fattah-2 was specifically designed to make that math impossible. Iran's hypersonic glide missile was first used in live combat on February 28, 2026, the opening day of this conflict. It carries a true hypersonic gliding warhead, giving it the ability to maneuver during flight, rather than following a fixed ballistic arc. It travels at speeds reportedly up to Mach 15. But the speed is almost secondary. The real problem is that the missile's path keeps changing. Standard interceptors lock onto a predicted impact point. When the Fattah-2 changes course mid-flight, the interceptor that was aimed at the old trajectory is now pointing at empty sky. The fire control system has to calculate an entirely new intercept solution in the time it takes the missile to close the remaining distance, and at Mach 15, that time is measured in seconds. The trajectory of this missile resembles Russia's Oreshnik system, which was deployed in Ukraine and similarly confounded European air defense tracking during its first use. Defense experts were already warning before this conflict that hypersonic glide vehicles represented the next unsolved problem in missile defense. Now, those warnings aren't theoretical anymore. On March 3, 2026, Iran used the Fattah-2 to strike a fortified IDF command center, reportedly KALing 7 senior officers. That strike alone changed the calculus of the conflict, proving that not even hardened military installations behind layers of defense are reliable sanctuaries anymore. Then came the strike that hit differently. Iran's Fattah-2 missiles targeted Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries, the two manufacturing facilities responsible for producing Israel's Iron Dome interceptors, its Arrow missiles, and its David's sling components. The missiles weren't just hitting targets, they were hitting the factories that build Israel's ability to stop the missiles. That is a level of strategic thinking that should make anyone paying attention genuinely uncomfortable. What happens to a shield when someone starts dismantling the workshop that repairs it? Israel's layered missile defense is the most technically sophisticated air defense architecture ever deployed by any nation. That is not an exaggeration. It represents decades of engineering, billions in investment, and continuous refinement through real-world conflict. And right now it is under the most sustained pressure it has ever faced. The system works in tiers. Iron Dome handles short-range rockets and artillery coming in at lower altitudes. David's sling occupies the middle. Larger rockets, cruise missiles, threats at ranges and altitudes Iron Dome wasn't designed for. Arrow 3 sits at the top of the stack, built specifically for long-range ballistic missiles high in the atmosphere before they descend toward their targets. Each layer was engineered to handle a specific threat profile. Each has performed impressively in isolated conflicts. But this campaign is not an isolated conflict. It is a sustained, high-intensity bombardment running at a pace no defense architect ever designed for. By late March 2026, the Royal United Services Institute, one of the most respected defense think tanks in the world, had estimated that 81.33% of Israel's pre-war Arrow interceptor stockpile had already been depleted, over 4/5 gone, not from a single catastrophic failure, from the arithmetic of attrition. Every successful interception costs an interceptor. Every wave of Iranian strikes forces another round of defensive expenditure. And here's the part that never makes the headlines. The attacker's missiles cost less to build than the defender's interceptors. The Khorramshahr-4 is expensive, yes, but the Arrow 3 interceptor costs vastly more to manufacture and takes far longer. Before this conflict, the U.S. was producing Arrow 3 interceptors at roughly 24 units per year. Iran has been firing more missiles than that in a single wave of strikes. The Pentagon announced plans to surge THAAD interceptor production from 96 to 400 units annually in response. But production ramp-ups take months, sometimes years, and this war is being fought today. Israel's defense ministry had already signed a multi-billion shekel emergency deal with Israel Aerospace Industries in December 2025 to expand Arrow 3 production, 6 months before this conflict exploded into its current scale. Reports emerged in mid-March claiming Israel had privately warned Washington that its ballistic missile interceptor stockpiles were running critically low. The IDF denied it publicly, calling the reports complete fake and suggesting Iran may have planted the story, but the denial itself revealed the sensitivity. When a country's defense ministry feels the need to aggressively discredit a report about ammunition levels, the world takes notice. What's not in dispute, the interceptor stockpile is finite. Iran's missile supply is not. And the mathematics of that imbalance only move in one direction over time. That direction is one Israel's military planners are well aware of, and it explains why Israeli counterstrikes on Iran are being conducted with a precision and targeting logic that goes far beyond simple retaliation. Here's something that gets lost in coverage of individual strikes. Iran isn't just firing missiles. Iran is executing a coordinated campaign designed to attack Israel's defensive architecture from 3 separate directions simultaneously. The Khorramshahr-4 delivers catastrophic destructive power from standoff range. The Fattah-2 defeats the intercept solution through maneuverability. And the Khorramshahr-4, the third major system in Iran's campaign, attacks the timeline itself. The Khorramshahr-4 is solid-fueled. That distinction sounds technical, but its operational significance is enormous. Liquid-fueled missiles require a fueling process before launch, a process that creates an observable window that intelligence assets can detect. Solid-fueled missiles sit ready indefinitely. They can be launched with preparation times significantly shorter than any liquid-fueled alternative. Less preparation time means a shorter window between when launch activity is detected and when the missile is already in the air. By the time early warning systems flag the launch signature, the missile may already be climbing toward cruising altitude. That compresses the response window for Israeli air defense, which now has even less time to bring interceptors online before the threat is in its terminal descent phase. By the 10th day of the war, Iran had fired a total of 300 missiles at Israel. Nearly half of them carried cluster submunitions. These weren't random salvos. The cluster variants are specifically engineered to drain shorter-range defense layers, Iron Dome and David's Sling, because each individual bomblet requires a separate intercept. One cluster missile can force a defense system to fire multiple interceptors per strike, burning through the stockpile at a multiplied rate. By late February, Iranian media claimed Khorramshahr-4 missiles had successfully penetrated Israel's layered air defense and struck designated targets. The IDF confirmed activations of its defense systems across multiple waves and acknowledged impacts in civilian areas, while maintaining that the majority of missiles were intercepted. But in a conflict where the majority still leaves dozens of impact sites across a civilian city, the distinction offers cold comfort to the people sheltering in basements, and sheltering they are, because the damage this campaign is doing to Israeli society extends far beyond buildings and craters. Cities are resilient. History has shown that repeatedly. But resilience is not the same as normalcy, and what Tel Aviv is experiencing right now is something that can only be described as the complete restructuring of daily life around the assumption of incoming fire. In the first days of the conflict, sirens sounded across central Israel with a frequency that forced residents to acknowledge this wasn't a brief episode. Emergency response teams from Meg and David Adom, Israel's ambulance and emergency service, reported significant destruction from cluster bomb debris across multiple Tel Aviv neighborhoods, including a shrapnel strike that injured a man and 2 children outside a residential building. By March 1st, 40 buildings in the Tel Aviv area had sustained damage in a single day. Structural engineers were called in to assess entire residential blocks before residents were permitted to return. Police and bomb disposal units worked around the clock to isolate unexploded submunitions scattered across public spaces. The social fabric is unraveling at a pace that's harder to photograph than crumbled concrete. Schools are closed or operating remotely, not for a day or a week, but across extended periods with no defined return date. Major public gatherings have been restricted or canceled. The rhythm of the city, the traffic of people commuting, eating, shopping, building things, has been replaced by an intermittent pulse defined by threat alerts and the intervals between them. Sleep deprivation has become a collective condition. You cannot sleep through sirens. You cannot maintain a normal work schedule when your day is punctuated by shelter periods of unpredictable duration. Economic productivity doesn't just drop in an acute crisis. It erodes slowly, compounding over weeks, as uncertainty becomes the permanent backdrop against which every decision is made. On the other side of the conflict, Iranian civilians are absorbing consequences of their own. Iranian cities have been subjected to airstrikes targeting military and strategic infrastructure. Disruptions to electricity, communications, and transportation have been reported across multiple regions. The civilian population of Iran did not choose this war any more than the civilians of Tel Aviv did. And both populations are paying the price for decisions made in command centers far above their daily lives. But the consequences of this conflict don't stop at either country's borders. There is one geographic bottleneck that connects this war directly to the fuel in your car, the price of your groceries, and the cost of heating your home. On February 28, 2026, something happened that energy economists had been modeling as a worst-case scenario for years. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, effectively closed. The newly inaugurated Iranian Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, in his first official statement following his father's death, ordered the IRGC to use what he called the lever of blocking the Strait of Hormuz as strategic leverage against the countries conducting strikes on Iran. Shipping through the roughly 2-mile-wide passage has all but halted since then. To understand what that means, you need to understand what moves through that strait every single day. Approximately 13 million barrels of crude oil per day pass through the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 31% of all maritime oil traded globally. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, every major Gulf producer depends on that route to move their exports to the world. Experts at CNBC and energy consultancies aren't mincing words about the implications. One analyst described the potential disruption as 3 times more severe than the Arab oil embargo and Iranian revolution of the 1970s, events that caused oil prices to spike so sharply they reshaped the global economy for years. If the strait stays closed, the world's buffer supply of oil burns through quickly, and physical shortages follow. Not just price increases, but actual scarcity of barrels. Markets are already responding. Insurance premiums for vessels in the Gulf have risen sharply. Shipping companies are conducting emergency risk assessments. Some are rerouting vessels entirely, accepting days of additional transit time as the cost of avoiding the Gulf. That elevated risk becomes embedded in global prices regardless of whether any specific attack occurs. Markets price expectations, and right now, expectations in the Strait of Hormuz are catastrophically elevated. Oil analyst Eric Nuttall called the disruption more severe in potential impact than the COVID pandemic. That is not an analyst being dramatic. That is the considered judgment of someone who tracks supply chains for a living and sees where the math leads. The global economy is not a spectator in this conflict. It is a participant, and it's being pulled in without having voted on it. Who is actually winning, and what comes next? By late March, the IDF announced that its campaign targeting Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure was nearly complete, days away from finishing strikes on the capabilities that had allowed Iran to build and fire its missile arsenal. That would represent a significant strategic achievement. But it came with an asterisk the size of a ballistic missile. Iran was still firing. Wave 58 of Operation True Promise 4 arrived on March 18th. The Houthis, Yemen's Iran-aligned militant group, officially joined the war, launching missiles and drones toward southern Israel and opening a second front that stretches Israeli air defense resources in an entirely new direction. What was already a structural challenge for Israel's interceptor stockpile became a 2-front structural challenge. The IDF is striking Iran's supply chain, missile factories, launch facilities, command infrastructure. Iran is striking Israel's supply chain, the factories that build the interceptors. Both sides are fighting a war about who can sustain longer. And in that kind of conflict, the question of who wins any individual day matters far less than the question of who can still fight on day 100. Neither government has publicly defined what an acceptable end to this conflict looks like. There is no stated condition under which Iran says it will stop firing. There is no stated condition under which Israel says its objectives are complete. That absence of a defined end state is not an oversight. It is the most dangerous feature of the entire situation. Analysts who assumed containment at earlier phases of this conflict were proven wrong at every stage. Every threshold that was expected to hold was crossed. Every red line that was expected to stop the escalation became instead a starting point for the next phase. That pattern does not suggest a trajectory toward a negotiated de-escalation. It suggests a trajectory toward something that hasn't happened yet, something that both sides are building toward whether they intend to or not. The global economy is registering disruptions whose full scale will take months to calculate. Civilian populations on both sides are absorbing consequences they didn't choose. The world's most advanced missile defense architecture is being drained by the most sophisticated missile campaign ever conducted by a state actor against a civilian population. And here's the question no one on any side has answered yet. When the interceptors run out, what does Tel Aviv look like the morning after? Because the missiles haven't stopped. The factories that built the shield are under attack. And the war that was supposed to be limited, calculated, and controlled has rewritten the boundaries of what's possible in the Middle East. One siren at a time. What happens next depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. And if history from the last few weeks is any guide, those decisions will surprise everyone who thought they had this figured out.